Welcome back, everyone. I'm pleased to begin part 2 of the CADTH information sessions, which includes priority updates from our key programs. You'll hear from members of our executive team and staff, and there'll be an opportunity for questions and clarification at the end of each section. There will also be a second open forum for questions on what you've heard today or any other topic that you'd like to hear directly from CADTH about. So we'll start with updates from our medical devices and clinical interventions portfolio. Please welcome Dr. Leslie Dunfield, our Vice President of Medical Devices and Clinical Interventions.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thanks to everybody who is attending and joining us here today to hear about some of the initiatives for the Medical Devices and Clinical Interventions Directorate at CADTH. And I'm going to go through some of the ways that the work of the devices portfolio is related to the 3 pillars from the strategic plan that was presented this morning. And first, by way of an overview, there are 2 CADTH committees who directly support the work of the Medical Devices and Clinical Interventions Directorate. First, we have the Device Advisory Committee, which is the advisory committee that helps us determine which products and topics to undertake, the decision points within the healthcare system where evidence might help to support decision-making, and also helps to identify those barriers and enablers for implementation. Next, we have the Health Technology Expert Review Panel, or HTERP. This is the panel that develops recommendations based on the information provided by CADTH and using their deliberative framework to develop recommendations. Both of these CADTH committees are currently seeking nominations for new members, and that link for the call for nominations will be included in the chat. We also work very closely with the Pan-Canadian HTA Collaborative. This is a group of 5 different HTA organizations across Canada who work together to share best practices, share expertise, as well as work to reduce duplication of effort within HTA. And this is an example to show that when we speak about the work in medical devices, it is much more than devices. We also look at assessments for clinical interventions, for behavioral interventions, screening and diagnostic tests, as well as surgical procedures. And we look at assessments of a technology across the life cycle. And this is an example of a technology that was identified within our Horizon Scanning program back in 2017. This was HPV self-sampling. We included this and incorporated it into recommendations in an HTA for cervical cancer screening, where HPV self-sampling was discussed within the review, but there was insufficient evidence for a recommendation for self-sampling. And recently, there has been additional information that has been published on HPV self-sampling. And so we've recently just published additional information on this specific technology, but this is an opportunity for us to take a look at the emerging evidence and potentially bring that back to HTERP to reassess those recommendations. And we identify those new and emerging technologies through our Horizon Scanning program. The Horizon Scanning program looks for new and emerging technologies that may have substantial impact on the healthcare system. These reports are used for health system planning, and so sharing these reports with decision makers to help them recognize what those implementation considerations might be if these technologies are taken up in the Canadian healthcare system. Internally, we use our Horizon Scanning reports for topic development to inform which topics we may undertake within HTA. And we have a number of different products that we do within the Horizon Scanning program, with overviews and early assessments being some of these products. But we've recently undertaken a new report within the Horizon Scanning program, the Technology Trends to Watch report. This is the second year we completed the Technology Trends to Watch report, which was just launched a couple of weeks ago. These are the top technology trends to watch that were identified in the 2020 report. And the 2021 report was the first version we did. And for this year's report, we did enhance the methods and uptake and engagement that we did for this work. And so as we move forward with our technology trends to watch work, our next steps are to take a look at this list and monitor the trends and technologies that were identified within this report to determine when and if it is appropriate for CADTH to do additional work. We also use the report to inform additional horizon scanning efforts and, again, for topic identification for HTA. We are currently in the process for planning next year's version of the Technology Trends to Watch report, where we are in the process of seeking feedback. So anybody who was involved with engagement or participation in any of the processes from the last review, we do welcome that feedback now as we get into planning phases for next year. And here are some examples of how we've used the Technology Trends to Watch report to inform some of the other work and follow the trends. And first, from the 2021 Technology Trends to Watch list, there was a number of horizon scanning reports that came out of the work that was done there. And this year's Technology Trends to Watch list identified a technology, which was actually something that we identified in the past with home dialysis programs. And this was something that we've also done HTA work on for appropriate use for home dialysis. And with emerging technologies and emerging evidence and advancements in technology, this actually came up again this year on the Technology Trends to Watch list. And this is an example of some current work that is underway. And this is stemmed from last year's Technology Trends to Watch list, where we identified stem cell transplant for multiple sclerosis through the regenerative medicine trend that was part of that report. And we've taken that report and we've done a horizon scanning review and also a rapid response as additional evidence has been emerging for that technology. There are a couple of new innovative approaches that we've taken with this work. The first one is that we are, instead of providing optimal use or appropriate use recommendations on this, because it is an emerging technology, the recommendations will be more about system readiness and preparing the system for this technology. The other innovative approach is incorporating a patient onto the committee. And so the work of the Health Technology Expert Review Panel, there are 7 core members, part of HTERP, but every project we have the ability to engage with at least 5 additional expert members. And this is a first for CADTH, where we've engaged a patient to sit on HTERP to provide their perspective to those deliberations. And the final innovative approach that we're taking here is that we're bringing non-HTA evidence to HTERP for those recommendations. And so in this case, a horizon scan and a rapid review is going to HTERP for recommendations. And this is something that the recommendations, when they're developed by HTERP, they will be posted on the website for feedback. And this should be coming in the coming month, a month or two. And so it is something to watch out for if there is an interest to provide input into that work. And so we did something different with that project where we're looking at non-HTA evidence, and a traditional HTA has a multidisciplinary approach using explicit methods and can incorporate a number of different components. But we can take this approach and modify it to better meet the needs and increase responsiveness. And this was certainly something that was necessary during the pandemic, where we saw a lot of new evidence coming, evidence in different forms, and emerging evidence, and the need to make decisions quickly. And so based on typical systematic review methods and potentially adding additional analysis to do in HTA, we can also accelerate those methods in the rapid response program to respond faster to meet those needs of decision makers who do need evidence quickly. And we have some other ways that we've been more responsive and done things a little bit faster to meet those needs with custom projects, some more informal work that we've been doing to help meet the needs during the pandemic, as well as ultra-rapid reviews and living reviews, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But it is important to note that the more we alter the methods or speed things up, this may affect the certainty of the evidence that we are able to provide. And so some additional innovative approaches, and I just mentioned living reviews. We conducted our first living review, and it was started prior to the pandemic, which was a great opportunity for us to learn the process and work on the methods before it actually became a necessity with the pandemic, where we had to continually looking at the evidence and keeping the reviews live by doing those updates. And so this was, that was a first for CADTH, but we have done other reviews that have been live. The next example is remote monitoring, and this was our first real deep dive into digital health. And instead of doing a formal clinical review for this, we actually did a realist review, which instead of looking at clinical effectiveness, it looked at the situations and context where remote monitoring may be the most effective. And this was our first deep dive into digital health, but it also brought up some considerations related to digital equity that were important to know in those recommendations. There are 2 upcoming webinars for remote monitoring. It's a 2-part webinar series, May 10th and May 17th. Registration for both of these events will be open on our website shortly, so you can look under the events page in the next day or so for that information. And then finally, the next 2 reports are ones that are currently underway. And so these are reports that are both using innovative approaches. The first one being engaging patients with both of these reports. And so there is a higher level of engagement with patients where they have been involved with informing the patient-important outcomes that we're looking at. They've spoken directly to research teams to help shape the reviews, and will be provided those opportunities to comment on the draft reviews. These 2 reviews are also incorporating approaches to assess diversity, equity, and inclusion, and bring that to the forefront for these 2 technologies, where these are technologies that there have been, are potentially some inequities with these technologies. And so these 2, this is again a first for CADTH, and they will both be posted on the website within the coming month as well. ICBT, or Internet Delivered Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, will be posted in May, with peer support posted in June for stakeholder feedback. And as we seek to engage more patients, and we are also seeking to collaborate more as well. And here are some examples of some collaborative projects that we've done with other pan-Canadian health organizations, as well as with other Canadian organizations. And so a great opportunity to work together and to complement each other's work. And we're also seeking for additional engagement as well. And we are in the planning phases of a summit to address health system challenges and priorities with decision makers across the country. We are in the planning phases, so it is still early, but we do hope to engage and reach out shortly to further plan that summit, and really are encouraging that engagement. We also are planning topic-specific roundtables where we're going to be engaging with clinicians, patients, industry, and other stakeholders to help us identify gaps and action plans for CADTH for topic-specific areas, and these are all ones that have been identified as priorities for CADTH. And you'll hear more about the post-COVID-19 condition when Gino comes to speak later. And so again, stay tuned for some opportunities for engagement there. And then finally, on the engagement, we do work quite closely with the Centre for Digital Health Evaluation and the Network for Digital Health Evaluation with our work on digital health, virtual care, apps, and we have done individual reviews on quite a number of virtual care or digital health technologies. And our traditional HTA approach has served us well. We've had to modify some components of that, but recognizing that digital health technologies do have certain criteria and components that are unique and may require a different approach. And so we're working with NICE and Health Canada around evaluation frameworks and how CADTH may need to modify its work to further enhance our work on digital health. And that ends some of the work on Anticipate, Innovate, and Transform for my section. And I'm now going to turn it over to Andrew Morrison. Andrew is a Program Development Officer at CADTH who leads our work on the Canadian Medical Imaging Inventory. Andrew.
So thank you for inviting me today to talk about the Canadian Medical Imaging Inventory. What I'd like to do over the next few minutes is to introduce you to the parameters of the inventory, discuss a little bit about our newly launched service, and also talk about some of our next steps as we plan for the future. So what is the Canadian Medical Imaging Inventory? There's a national web-based survey that's conducted approximately once every 2 years. We collect data from around 500 public and privately funded healthcare facilities across Canada. At this time, we're focused on advanced imaging equipment only, and that includes CT, MRI, SPECT, SPECT-CT, and the 2 PET hybrids. This is the largest collection of real-world data that's available in Canada at the national level, and I believe it's the only publicly available resource of this kind. So we collect four broad categories of real-world data, and that includes access data, so the number and location of imaging equipment across the country. Usage data, this includes but certainly isn't limited to exam volumes, the hours of operation of equipment, including downtime, evening and weekend use, and the types of use of the imaging equipment by broad clinical indications. Another area of data that we look at is supportive tools and services. This would include, and again is not limited to, artificial intelligence, appropriate use tools, clinical decision support tools, centralized audit entry, and peer review programs. Many of these tools can be used to minimize wait lists. And finally, we look at technical data, and this really looks at the unit specifications of equipment. We look at the make and model of equipment, how old it is. If it's MRI, for example, we'll look at how many magnets it has, and if it's open or closed bore. We look at PACS access within and between jurisdictions, and we also look at maintenance service agreements for each of these imaging modalities at the site level. So collecting this data over time, we've currently conducted 3 iterations of this report, allows us to monitor trends of development in advanced imaging equipment. One of the areas we look at the most often is the adoption of new imaging modalities, such as PET MRI, which is currently available in 5 hospitals across Canada and is used exclusively for research purposes. And we also look at the disinvestment of imaging modalities. And a good example of this would be the gradual transition from SPECT to SPECT-CT. This data also allows us to track the integration of supportive tools, such as artificial intelligence and clinical decision support tools, and it allows us to forecast the future demand of imaging equipment. So we're able to provide decision makers from every province and territory with predictions around how many pieces of equipment they're likely to need over the next 20 years. So how is the CMII data used by decision makers? Well, fundamentally, it's used to guide strategic planning and thinking, and in this capacity, it's used for capital planning purposes and also for equipment replacement strategies. It's used by decision makers to identify gaps in service because we know the location of each and every advanced imaging equipment across Canada. It also informs decision makers on purchasing decisions and allows us to identify group purchasing opportunities. It can rationalize the replacement of aging infrastructures, particularly the data we capture on the age of equipment, and also allows decision makers to anticipate human resource requirements over the next several years. Often we use our data on a number of exams, either at the site, regional or provincial level, to help with these requirements. And finally, from an HTA perspective, it can inform HTA agendas because we are aware of technologies that are new and emerging in radiology departments that may be suitable for further assessment. There are a number of CMII-related products in addition to the main report, and this includes the Quick Facts dashboard, our provincial summaries, previous iterations of the CMII reports, there are 3 in total, and an in-brief, which is a high-level summary of our main findings. Last year, we set up a formal request service, but I should add that prior to that, for at least 2 years, we had been responding to decision makers' requests for at least 2 years, and I think we completed about 30 of them. So in January, after we published our last national survey, we launched the pilot service. And since then, we've completed around 40 requests for information of all different shapes and sizes. 13 of these have resulted in reports that are publicly posted on the CMII webpage. The scope of the service has really evolved since we first launched it. We had anticipated that we would receive requests, as we had done for the previous 2 years, that was specifically limited to data captured in our database. But decision makers wanted something different. In fact, they wanted something more. And they wanted us to use our network of contacts across Canada in radiology and nuclear medicine departments and with decision makers to conduct short surveys and also seek the advice of specific experts. They've also asked us to prepare short reports on imaging-related practices and policies across Canada and to write up on some technical innovations. There have been a number of themes that have emerged with the 40 requests that we've received. One of these themes is imaging-related innovations intended to limit the spread of infection. This would include CT in the box and bedside MRI, both reports that are available on our website. We've also conducted quite a bit of work on mobile imaging. For example, we've used our data to look at the extent of its use in Canada, how many mobile units there are, the average distance between sites that use one mobile equipment, and we've also done some work on the benefits and weaknesses on this kind of service delivery. Finally, the area that we've been most involved in, I would say about 35% of all of our requests are related to PET-CT. We've published 7 reports in this area. We've covered areas such as its role in neuroimaging, the comparison of exams and publicly funded indications within Canada and also internationally. We've looked at the future of PET-CT, and we've considered the implementation considerations when setting up a new PET-CT facility. Now our next steps. We're currently preparing for the launch of our 4th iteration of this national survey, and we're also expanding our service scope. So we'll now be looking at various areas within interventional imaging, image-guided radiotherapy, and mammography. These 3 areas were specifically chosen because we had a pan-Canadian consultation just over a year ago with decision makers who identified these as being the areas of the greatest interest. And over the next several months, we will be contacting stakeholders across Canada to ensure that we're asking the right questions. Thank you.
And now we'll ask Gino DeAngelis, Manager of Clinical Research at CADTH, to introduce the work on post-COVID-19 condition.
Thanks, Leslie, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gino DeAngelis. I'm a Clinical Research Manager, and I will be sharing more information on CADTH's condition level review on post-COVID-19 condition. Next slide, please. In the summer of 2021, CADTH started receiving questions from our jurisdictional customers about a new condition or set of symptoms appearing in people who had survived COVID-19. Post-COVID-19 condition, commonly referred to as long COVID, is a new condition recognized by the Public Health Agency of Canada and the World Health Organization. It has the potential to affect hundreds of thousands of people in Canada and millions of people worldwide. Next slide. There's still a great amount of uncertainty surrounding this new condition and many questions on what the healthcare system needs to do to prepare. The latest case definition just came to us by the World Health Organization back in October of 2021 with a need to develop and implement care pathways and guidelines. Post-COVID-19 condition may affect different organ systems, including pulmonary, cardiovascular, neurological, and musculoskeletal systems, among others. We're already starting to see wider consequences than just health, including work absenteeism, benefits, with many emerging questions. Patient-led movements continue to raise awareness about this condition, and those affected advocate for its recognition, as it's not been given similar attention as acute COVID-19. And there remains uncertainties on how to best capture data and surveillance. Next slide. So following CADTH's strategic pillar, Anticipate, and enabling a future-ready healthcare, our first response to this topic was a Horizon Scan report. And that was published back in the fall of 2021, which served really as an early awareness tool to provide information for decision makers. The report identified system considerations, including demand for services, allocation of resources, and impact on health equity, which you saw is one of CADTH's guiding principles in our strategic plan. Next slide. Late last year, we continued our response by initiating a condition level review on post-COVID, which is in line with CADTH's Innovate and Transform strategic pillars. So different than our typical HTAs that would look at one aspect of the condition or a single intervention, a condition level review looks across care pathways and considers both drug and non-drug interventions, and could also include multiple health technologies. Condition level reviews are still quite new to CADTH, as this is our second review. We've taken several lessons learned from our first one, which was on tuberculosis, One key takeaway, and considering the post-COVID landscape, really was that conditional reviews will never look quite the same overall, as they need to be customized to meet the decision makers' needs and the healthcare landscape. However, we are able to follow a similar process, which I will soon describe right now. Next slide. So you see the following diagram provides our overall plan for this post-COVID conditional review, which we're conceptualizing in 3 main phases. The project began with extensive information gathering and understanding the needs of decision makers, establishing connections with a range of stakeholders, and also identifying completed work and knowledge gaps. Given the rapidly evolving space and speed at which information and stakeholders develop, this was extensive and will remain ongoing. We're now entering the second phase, which includes more active research involving either conducting de novo work or brokering and sharing work conducted by others, and then mobilizing that knowledge to ensure it's shared with those who need it. Throughout, we aim for high stakeholder engagement, including decision makers, clinicians, researchers, and patient representatives. Next slide. As mentioned, the first phase entailed extensive scoping and engagement to fully understand the landscape. In the fall of 2021, CADTH's implementation support and knowledge mobilization team conducted a survey amongst Canadian jurisdictions to identify which organizations were monitoring or considering the impact of post-COVID on health services, and to also identify early evidence needs. Partnerships, another one of CADTH's guiding principles, and our team started to develop connections with national and international evidence synthesis, guideline development, and HTA organizations. We also engaged research communities and those with lived experience, which eventually led to the convening of a pan-Canadian stakeholder panel. Next slide. The primary objective of the stakeholder panel was to help inform the direction of this condition level review, while ensuring relevant stakeholder and jurisdictional perspectives are considered. Other objectives of the panel were to facilitate collaboration and ultimately reduce duplication of effort. Panelists consist of decision makers, clinical experts, patient representatives, researchers, and other subject experts. Next slide. So what did we hear from all of this extensive engagement? We were able to identify a range of needs from various jurisdictions, with the most interest, not surprisingly, coming from those who were hit hardest by COVID, and less so from those who were not as impacted. But we're now starting to see this change. Some commonly identified needs include supporting and collaborating, evidence generation and brokering, the need for an information hub, and convening and connecting. Next slide. We spent time developing our networks, learning who the key stakeholders are, making connections, understanding where the information is so that we can direct our customers, and also aim to collaborate where possible and feasible, again, to reduce duplication of effort. 2 examples of CADTH collaborating with stakeholders to get work done quicker were a collaborative systematic review with the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Alberta Research Centre for Health Evidence. This systematic review was on risk factors and preventative interventions. And another example is a contribution by CADTH to the McMaster team's e-COVID-19 living map of recommendations with a focus on post-COVID condition guidelines. Next slide. CADTH is currently wrapping up a scoping review, which is another first for us that aimed to map out the current evidence landscape and identify knowledge gaps. This scoping review also has the potential to be a foundation for future rapid evidence queries. Using findings from the scoping review, jurisdictional input that we've already obtained, and the stakeholder panel, we've identified a need for understanding post-COVID subtypes, and we've already initiated a rapid review on this topic. We're also currently synthesizing information about existing post-COVID-19 guidelines based on our scoping review and collaborative work with the McMaster Group and the recommendations map. Next slide. The need for an information hub was identified, which could act as a resource for information sharing, providing up-to-date evidence, and to increase awareness of ongoing initiatives. Those working in this area could visit the platform and see a snapshot of post-COVID-19 work in Canada and relevant Canadian decision-making. We're currently planning the platform's development. Next slide, please. CADTH's implementation support and knowledge mobilization team is developing a stakeholder map to identify those who are involved in post-COVID work. In May, we plan on hosting an invitational roundtable to convene and connect federal, provincial, and territorial stakeholders involved in the funding, planning, development, implementation, and/or evaluation of post-COVID condition models of care. The aim will be to present and discuss evidence, experiences, needs, and opportunities related to the development and sustainability of patient-centered models of care for individuals with post-COVID conditions. And with our existing mechanisms, such as our scoping review and our stakeholder panel, we will identify and engage a range of stakeholders to continue to identify and respond to evidence needs and share information rapidly to support decision-making needs. Next slide. So moving forward, and lastly, a few points on where we go from here. So we plan to continue with our ongoing support of evidence needs, with continued brokering and knowledge mobilization. We continue to develop the information platform and convene and connect, all with the renewed focus on collaboration and avoiding duplication. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, Andrea, and Gino. I should have done a reminder when we kicked off this half of the session that if you'd like to raise your hand for questions, please look for the icon in the top right-hand corner that looks like the silhouette of a raised hand, and feel free to submit your questions through that route. You will see me holding my phone. Those questions will be relayed to me. So we're going to pause here for a few questions on any of the three presentations that you've just seen. Again, if this isn't the right time for you, we will have more opportunity for questions later in the second half. So the first question that has come in, I'm going to direct to you, Leslie. Are there opportunities for patient organizations to collaborate with CADTH on complex conditions that touch on different clinical specialties or draw on multiple types of health technologies? If so, that would be amazing.
Thank you for the question. And with patient engagement, we are certainly interested in having additional engagement, and with our patient engagement team, making those linkages to support the work that we are doing. And so in the case of the work Gino just presented with post-COVID-19 condition, there have been opportunities for patient engagement into that work. And that is something that we continue to seek, and anything that we do produce, we post on the website for stakeholder feedback. And so this is another opportunity for anybody who is interested in the work that we are producing to provide input. And those are circulated and posted up on the website, and there are two that are upcoming for the work that we're doing, and certainly encourage any of that engagement and input into the work that we do.
Thanks, Leslie. I don't see any other questions at this time. So again, if you do have anything that pops up in your as you're thinking about it, please feel free to add them to the list of questions, and we'll address them at the open forum. And again, if there are questions from this morning that you've thought about over the lunch hour, you're welcome to submit those now as well. At this point, I'd like to turn the podium over to Brent Fraser, Vice President of Pharmaceutical Reviews, for a snapshot of what's underway within our drug program.
Thanks, Suzanne. So I'm going to give a brief overview or a bit of a snapshot of what's happening within the Pharmaceutical Review Program right now. And Mandy Allard is going to talk more specifically about some of the changes that we are undertaking within our drug review process. And that'll be followed up by Peter Deirdre, who is going to talk a bit more about some of the optimal use work that we're doing, which is often people are not aware of those types of activities that occur within our program. So this first slide, I appreciate, is very busy. These slides will be available on our website, so you can certainly refer to this at a later point in time. But there's a few things that I wanted to highlight. So as with everybody else, we immediately pivoted 2 years ago to a virtual environment. Our committee members all went virtual, our committee meetings, all of our reviews and engagement with experts moved to a virtual environment as well. And during that time, we were able to keep pace with the volume of submissions that were coming through to CADTH for review. And if we look at what happened last year, there was 86 drugs that went through for review. Of those, 73 have been completed. The others are in various forms of completion. But what I wanted to highlight is the 7 implementation panels that had been requested from CADTH in response to emerging technologies, and in particular COVID, where jurisdictions needed recommendations quickly. These were not drugs that would go through a formal HTA process because we recognized a couple of things. First off, we didn't have a lot of information around the cost of these treatments, but more importantly, the evidence is still evolving, and Health Canada was approving these drugs through a different process, and the jurisdictions required some sort of guidance before they started funding them within their own jurisdictions. So we did implement a number of panels to look at these drugs to provide recommendations to the jurisdictions around how can they actually provide access to their patients based on the guidelines that had been produced both by ourselves and also other science tables as well. We implemented a number of process improvements over that time period, and I think we've been extremely busy in trying to really streamline our review processes, making it a bit easier for the team and our committees, and also trying to be more transparent about some of the work that we are doing within our drug review processes. So there's been a number of process changes that have been implemented, and those are often updated on a monthly, or you'll hear about those on a monthly basis through our pharmaceutical review updates. Some other things just to note is the number of HTA-OU projects that have been done within the program, looking at various areas such as blood plasma treatments, plaque psoriasis, which Peter will talk about in his presentation, but some other common conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis as well. So certainly we have not seen a reduction in the volume of work over the last couple of years. And I think originally when COVID first started, there was a sense that we may actually slow down on the number of reviews that we are doing, primarily because we felt that industry might be caught with the process and slow down their submissions, but that was not the case. And we continue to see year over year projections that have actually exceeded our forecasts. In particular, for the last couple of years, we've been just shy of 80 submissions that we have reviewed and provided recommendations. And this has required a lot of additional effort by our expert committee members as well, and often we are doing 2-day meetings every month in order to keep up with the capacity of reviews and submissions that have come into the program. So a presentation by myself would not be complete if I didn't talk about pre-NOC submissions. And I wanted to point to this particular piece of work that was done by an independent group, which is the Center for Innovative Regulatory Sciences, or CIRS for short. And they have shown, looking at sequential reviews that would be done for CADTH products in comparison to those products in which companies sent them prior to Health Canada's approval. And we refer to that as pre-NOC submissions. So I think you can see quite clearly that the amount of time that's required between submitting to Health Canada and CADTH making a funding recommendation is substantially shortened if companies take advantage or sponsors take advantage of the pre-NOC process. And I can't emphasize this enough because we are not seeing all of our submissions come through, which is what we would think is ideal. I think it's around 65% of our submissions come through the pre-NOC submission process. The other part that I really want to advocate for is the consent that is signed by the companies that allow Health Canada to share their information with us in a very streamlined, efficient manner. It can speed up the reviews, so there is a distinct advantage to the sponsors, but more importantly to patients, because it can help shorten some of our review times and it makes the submission process much more efficient. And as we're looking at potentially making changes to how we do our reviews, we're seeing that this is becoming more and more critical as time proceeds. And I would say at this point, we probably only have about maybe 50% of the submissions come through where the consent form has been signed. And as we're talking about strategic changes, I just wanted to touch base on a couple of things with respect to how we're moving forward within the pharmaceutical review processes. We've talked a bit or a lot today about incorporating information around diversity, equity, and inclusion into our reimbursement products and recommendations, and much of the products or projects that we're doing related to drug therapy. I think we're, in some respects, maybe a bit hamstrung in the fact that the clinical evidence that we review to support our recommendations often do not reflect the population of patients we see within Canada. And so we're looking at how we can identify those gaps and what do we do with those gaps with respect to our reimbursement recommendations. So that is something that we'll continue to work on along with other areas of the organization to figure out what the best approach is to addressing these gaps and the information we have. And the last thing I just wanted to talk about, this was spurred primarily with COVID. All the other HTA organizations were looking at the same pieces of information, and it really resulted in a coalescence of HTA groups coming together and talking about opportunities for collaboration. It started out with COVID, but we're having more discussions around other areas of HTA work, and particularly looking at what the regulators have done in sharing information or work amongst regulators, people still respecting the decision-making of the individual organizations. But I think there's a lot for us to learn, and we've been having some general discussions with other Commonwealth HTA organizations to see what is it that we can do, if we can do anything, to help share work and really become much more efficient. And I think as we see more and more complex technologies and more submissions coming forward, this is going to be important for us in the future to be able to help sustain the volume of work that's required for us to do our reviews. I'll stop there and I'll pass it over to Mandy.
Great, thank you, Brent, and welcome to our virtual audience. J'espère que vous avez passé un bon matin et un bon dîner. Great. So earlier this morning, Suzanne presented CADTH's new strategic plan. So you've already heard about our strategic pillars and the guiding principles that will be guiding CADTH's work for the next 3 years. And I bet you're probably wondering, how is this going to affect the CADTH reimbursement reviews program, given that this is more of a reactive type of program since we review drugs that are submitted by sponsors or at the request of the public drug plans. So we do have an opportunity to meet with sponsors before a submission is filed, and this is also known as the pre-submission meeting. And this meeting is generally the first opportunity that the sponsor has to introduce a new drug product to CADTH. Now, in case you're not familiar with these meetings, most of our key stakeholders are in attendance. So generally it's a meeting between CADTH and the sponsor, but the public drug plans can also attend as observers. So now keep in mind, as Brent just mentioned, we review a lot of drugs in any given year, and we're consistently seeing that more and more files are being submitted for review. So it's more important now, than it has ever been to ensure that these meetings are being used to their fullest potential and that all stakeholders walk away from these touch points being aware of what they need to consider so that they're prepared to move forward with the new drug technology. So in CADTH's experience, these meetings are most beneficial when there's an opportunity for a meaningful discussion between CADTH and the sponsor. Ultimately, we're hoping that sponsors leave the meeting with a really good understanding of what they need to do on their end and what needs to be included in their submission to make sure that it's accepted for review by CADTH. From our end, we're hoping for the opportunity to ask a lot of questions, and we're hoping that sponsors will answer our questions in in an open and transparent manner, so that we can walk away ourselves with a really good understanding of how complex the file might be, and so that we can be ready for when it comes. So how can we achieve these goals? Well, my advice to the sponsors is to prepare and to provide your questions in advance, and to identify the key issues for consideration that can form the basis of a discussion. And also, it's important to keep in mind that we are going to be spending a lot of time with this file. So we appreciate a good overview, but there's no need to get into the finer details at this point. And ultimately, this is just a really good time to work out any bugs, make sure everybody's on the same page, so that we can all do our best to ensure that the file moves smoothly through the CADTH reimbursement process and avoid any potential delays. So engaging in meaningful discussions at the beginning of the review is only the first point at which we're hoping to add impact to our reimbursement review process. Again, to reiterate one of the points that Brent made earlier, there's been a consistent and a sustained increase in the volume of both oncology and non-oncology submissions over the past couple of years. And I'm sure a lot of you have also heard me say that these submissions are becoming more and more complex as we're seeing different types of trial methodologies and more different types of indirect evidence and different types of supportive evidence to fill the gaps. And we're trying really hard to incorporate all of this into our reviews. So all of this is to say, really, that we need to make some changes to make sure that our program is sustainable. And one of the things that we're doing to achieve this is to focus our efforts on where CADTH adds the most value to the reimbursement system. And I've outlined each of these points on the slide in front of you. We've got the three key points here, which is in our appraisal and interpretation of key evidence, which factors into the decisions for a recommendation. And then CADTH's other key strength is to present this in the Canadian context by consolidating and integrating stakeholder perspectives from patients, clinicians, and the drug programs, in addition to the perspective already presented by the sponsor. CADTH is also really good at effectively communicating this key information to our stakeholders, who are generally the end users of our reports. And who are these people? Well, it's CADTH's own health economic review team, as they rely on the clinical assessment to inform and validate the assumptions of the pharmacoeconomic model. And of course, it's the expert members of our CDEC and our PERC committees who look to CADTH to provide complete objective assessments to help inform their decisions about the recommendation. So in the spirit of our renewed focus on this value add, we just announced a new submission requirement for oncology and non-oncology drugs that will be targeting the April 2023 PERC and CDEC meetings, which is the sponsor summary of clinical evidence. Now, I do want to let you know, because some of you may not be aware of how lucky you ended up being, but we've actually pushed this date back based on feedback that we did get from our industry partners. We were hoping, and I guess being maybe a little overly optimistic on our ends, really hoping to roll this out for the January expert committee meetings, but we've heard and we listened that this wasn't going to be feasible from your end, so April it is. So essentially, this means that any submissions that we receive in October, we will be expecting to see this completed new template. So within this requirement, we're asking our sponsors to conduct a systematic literature review and provide summaries of indirect comparative evidence along with other supporting evidence. We've published, if you've seen it, we've published a very comprehensive annotated template to provide guidance about the level of evidence that we are looking for. And I assure you, it's meant to be helpful, not cumbersome. So please do take your time and take a read through it. And I'm not going to get into the details of this template today, because I'm sure we could go on and on and on about this for a very, very long time. But we will be holding a Q&A type session within the next few months, once people have had a chance to digest the information and start working with it. So keep an eye out for that. And of course, everybody's probably wondering, well, why? Why did we make this change? So as previously mentioned, we really do need to ensure that this program is sustainable for the years to come. And we're hoping to make our own internal processes more efficient so that our review teams can focus on the tasks that do add more value and the information that people are looking for, as I've already described. And what are the benefits to our industry partners? Well, this provides an opportunity to participate in our standardized process and objectively highlight the key clinical evidence, as well as a chance to identify and address the gaps in the evidence on your own. I know a lot of sponsors are already providing a very similar type of document in the form of a clinical summary. And with this new sponsor's summary of clinical evidence, you can be sure that we will be referring to this document as we begin our review. So to accompany this change and leverage this summary of clinical evidence provided in the submission, CADTH is currently revising our own template to focus on areas where we expect CADTH to have an increased impact and add value, as I've already discussed. Overall, we're streamlining our clinical review reports with the aim of providing a simplified, clear report that will be accessible to a wider audience. We're also expecting that it will be less of a burden on industry when this new report and this new format is sent for review and comment during the review phase. As a bit of a teaser, we're looking at adopting new methods to further standardize our own evidence appraisal. But that's all I'm going to say for now. You'll have to tune in later for more details. So while I'm on this topic, I think it's important to raise that we here at CADTH do understand that this is a big change, but it is something we have been considering for a long time, and hopefully I've been able to communicate today why we're heading in this direction. But I really want to underscore that CADTH is committed to ensuring that these changes do have the intended impact and they're not associated with any unanticipated consequences or effects. So we are going to be monitoring our process to ensure that submission filing timelines aren't affected, that we're continuing to provide the best information to the end users of our reports and our recommendations, and that the instructions within the template are clear for all intended users, and that no training is required for anybody to complete them. And as we continue to move forward and refine and improve our processes, we'll continue to be on the lookout for other opportunities where we can further harmonize with other local and international HTA agencies so that all stakeholders involved can benefit from increased efficiency within the reimbursement review process. So this morning we heard a lot about the need for agility as part of the launch of our new strategic plan. So I do also want to take this opportunity to highlight that our reimbursement reviews program is in fact becoming more agile despite the necessary rigor of following a well-defined procedure. In the fall, we departed from our old rigid ways of restricting requests for reconsideration to evidence that was submitted as part of the initial submission package. We've adapted our procedures to allow for the sponsor to submit new information when requesting that a draft recommendation be reconsidered, provided that this new evidence addresses a gap that was identified by the expert committee and that said evidence wasn't available during the review phase. And in addition to those criteria, there's a few others outlined on the slide as well. By allowing this new information, we're making sure that the expert committee members have access to the most up-to-date, relevant evidence to ensure to consider during their deliberations. And we've been really pleased to see that quite a few of the sponsors are actually taking advantage of this opportunity in this new process. But my plea to you is to please ensure that any new information that you wish to include as part of this process is provided along with the initial request for reconsideration and in a format that allows the CADTH review team to conduct a thorough and complete appraisal and summary of the evidence. So as we launch our new strategic plan, I just want to whet your appetite to give you an idea of other initiatives that will be happening that are affecting the reimbursement review program. I've thrown a few of these up on the slide in front of you, and I won't go through them all because I know that some of our presenters will be touching on these, and I definitely don't want to steal their thunder. But just to highlight a few, We're going to be looking at how we can better incorporate ethical considerations into our complex reviews. We're also going to be working with public drug plans to determine the best way to issue time-limited recommendations, which are essentially recommendations that are contingent upon further evidence development. And as always, we're continuing to find ways to increase transparency. So with that, I'd like to end my presentation by emphasizing that many of us here today probably do what we do because we have a shared goal of improving access to innovative medicines to patients across Canada in a timely and sustainable manner. I hope you're starting to notice that our reimbursement reviews team is more open to dialogue with all of our stakeholders, and I look forward to working with you as this process continues to evolve. Merci pour votre attention.
Thanks, Mandy. I'll introduce myself, I guess. Just kidding. It's nice to be here in front of a live audience. Used to presenting in the Zoom culture where a lot of my material comes back with silence and you're not sure if you aren't doing well or everyone's on mute. So today I will validate that my material is in fact bad. Or good. Good start. So my name's Peter Durda. I'm the Policy and Program Development Manager for the Pharmaceutical Reviews team here at CADTH. And Mandy's team really focuses on the reactive reviews. We focus on the proactive reviews. So things that our jurisdictions ask us to look at. So we were very excited when we saw these strategic pillars for the next 3 years because we felt we were already ahead of the curve. Because a lot of the things that are included in these pillars are things that we are already doing. So anticipate, meaning fit for purpose, that's a lot of the things that we are focused on already. So streamlining processes, making things faster, meeting the needs of decision makers, those are our bread and butter. Secondly, to innovate, unleashing the value across the life cycle, well, we focus mostly on appropriate use, which is later on in the life cycle, so we're already there. Thirdly, transform. Now that's something I think we're uniquely qualified to do on our team, and that's around formulary management. So looking at giving advice to decision makers to help them meet the needs of the complex healthcare system. So with those, I'll talk to you a little bit about things that we've been doing, things that we plan to do. So as Brent already mentioned, some of the work around COVID therapeutics have already met these guiding principles and these strategic pillars. So we've been very nimble and agile to provide advice on 2 reviews already, and very transparent by publishing these reviews online with great impact. The second thing is around the expanded algorithms, which are rapid algorithms, which we post for stakeholder feedback in just 2 months. So that again increases our ability to be transparent and agile. But that was the last few months. So what are we doing next year? So here's our focus really for the next year and these 4 initiatives. And you would have seen the first 2 were actually posted for stakeholder feedback last Thursday, the non-sponsored single drug review and the streamlined drug class review. Not to be confused with my dyslexia, the non-class drug review and the streamlined sponsor review. There's, I guarantee, a lot of class in these reviews. So my material is not very good. It's not just Zoom mute. The third thing is around drug shortages. So, with global supply issues around the world, there is going to be more questions coming to CADTH from decision makers about what are therapeutic alternatives when we can't access drugs due to manufacturing issues. And lastly, utilization analyses. So some of the work that we've sort of started doing that we'll be publishing in the next year, can we sort of increase our capacity there? So the non-sponsored review specifically, so this is really around repurposing old drugs. So drugs that have not been reviewed for whatever reason, but there is a demand from patients, from clinicians, to use them. But without a review, payers can't necessarily put them on the formulary without some sort of ad hoc process. So we formalize that. And that means that there's rigor, there's transparency, and there's agility because it's not the same requirements as you would have as a standard review. And we're going to do this within 6 months. So that's the first process, and we look forward to stakeholder feedback, of course, due April 14th. The second is a streamlined class review. So here, it's really about trying to solve the problem around therapeutic reviews. So we've done a few of them, but they're very cumbersome. I like the term Mandy used. They're complex and time-consuming, so we can't do a lot. They take over 12 months. But sometimes there's a lot of really great published literature out there that we could leverage, and why not? So let's be fit for purpose, and let's do these reviews within a 6-month time period to be agile. And again, looking forward to your stakeholder feedback, due April 14th. Drug shortages, we've touched on. So what can we do to bring to the payer some advice about therapeutic alternatives? Let's be agile, let's have impact, and let's provide patients with options in their need. And finally, the utilization analyses that we're working on. Nicole is going to touch on quite a few of these later, so don't want to take away too much of the thunder, Nicole. But there's great examples of us providing advice for payers to help them transform. So we're doing work in RWE, or real world evidence, not to use acronyms, around multiple myeloma, where we're working with a registry and actually looking at patient level data. And that's something that we'll be publishing this summer. So that's something novel. CADTH hasn't done that before. We're about to publish a review in arthritis, so looking at conventional medications and where they should be used and how to harmonize their criteria. And finally, for biologics and psoriasis, looking at the old versus the new generation. So is there good value for payers and for prescribers of the new versus the old? So those reports will be published soon, and we'll be doing more of that kind of work in the future. So my last slide, in terms of initiatives for beyond next year, just to sort of try to crystal ball areas where there is a need. So fit for purpose reviews for pediatrics, so not pediatric drugs, but drugs with pediatric indications. Right now there's a large need there. The other is addressing gaps in reassessment procedures. So there are procedures currently today, but we need to relook at them to see, are they still viable for today's market? And lastly, let's build capacity and relationships to do more utilization analyses. So let's partner with groups like CADTH, like private insurers, to continue to do this kind of work that we've started. Okay, and so with that, I will pass it on to Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent, Mandy, and Peter. Once again, we're going to take a pause and see if there are any questions, and I know we have some questions at this point in time. So I'm actually going to start at the end and work my way backwards. So since Peter is nearby, the first question is for you, Peter. And the question is, can patients request non-sponsored single drugs review? Is that on the table at this time?
Thanks, Suzanne. That's a great question. So the concept behind non-sponsor is if there is a need and a demand from patients and physicians, that it's actually the jurisdictions, the payers that come to CADTH and ask for the review. And so patients can certainly very indirectly discuss that with their local drug plan and work with them to ask for a non-sponsored review at this time. And I think that's sort of how we've positioned this up to now, and we think that that should work fairly well, at least for the near term.
Thanks, Peter. And Mandy, there's a question for you. I'm actually going to try it first, and you can chime in if I haven't got it correct. So the question is with regard to the new information during the reconsideration review process, to confirm products must have been reviewed through an expedited pathway at Health Canada to be eligible. My understanding is that's not correct. That's one of the criteria. And that when you take a look at the slides, there are other circumstances where that may be appropriate. Don't know if you'd like to chime in with anything additional.
Hi, yes, thank you for the question. Yes, Suzanne, that's right. So that list of criteria, it's not an all or none, right? Because all of these situations, right, they're always different, and we like to consider things on a case by case basis. But those are the guiding principles that we look for, and yeah, thank you.
And Brent, your slide about the Sears review generated a few questions. So I'm going to take a chance here. So the first one, I appreciate that one of our viewers has said, I don't understand why sponsors would not want to sign the consent to have Health Canada share file details with CADTH, and that comes from one of our sponsors. There are a couple of other questions, though. Brent, do you have the data on HTA review times comparing pre-NOC submissions with and without consent to information sharing? Can you say how much faster on average the reviews are with that information versus those without?
So we haven't done a detailed analysis on that, and I don't think Sears would have had that information to be able to do that assessment for us. Anecdotally, though, we do know of situations where we have been able to bring a file to an earlier CDEC or PERC meeting as a result of information sharing. We also have some examples, not necessarily in the drug review space, but in some of the implementation panel work that we've done, where one company has, within the same therapeutic category, one has signed the consent form and another has not. And the timelines to complete that analysis and do the reviews was significantly longer with the non-consent product versus the consent product. So that's probably something we should take a look at more closely. But at this point, I can really just refer to kind of anecdotal situations where it has made a difference.
Thanks, Brent. Could you also comment on the potential to reduce submission requirements for manufacturers who consent to the information sharing between Health Canada and CADTH? For example, are there things that do not need to be resubmitted or produced if the manufacturer consents to information sharing? Greater transparency on what is shared would also be very much appreciated and may increase uptake.
So I think maybe I can get Mandy to help me out with this, but one example, I guess, is the Clarifaxes. So when the Clarifaxes go out, we receive a copy right at the same time that it goes out to the manufacturer as well. I think there's a concern that we are receiving information that goes beyond the scope of our reviews, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, A, we don't want that, and B, Health Canada is very cognizant of what they share with external partners, and so they are very cautious. But that's just an example of, rather than if we didn't have consent, the Clarifax would have to go to the manufacturer would then have to submit it through collaborative spaces into our process, and then if we have any questions, we would have to get back to the manufacturer on that. Whereas if we have consent sharing, Health Canada can just provide that information directly to us, and that just saves a number of steps, both for ourselves, but also for the sponsor of the file.
Thanks, Brent. Peter, this question is for you. Peter, at the end of your comments, you mentioned about including private insurer data. A question about how is that pertinent to CADTH's public perspective, given the very different value and perspectives?
Thanks, Suzanne. Happy to take that question. So actually, we've partnered with CALIA, the Canadian Life and Health Insurance Industry Association, for our psoriasis work. And really it comes down to, obviously CADTH's main customers are public payers, but when it comes to drug utilization and drug spending, the ultimate payer is the taxpayer. It's all of us. And in many categories, private insurance does account for a significant portion of spend, sometimes more than 50%. So, you get an incomplete picture if you only look at public spend, especially when patients often transition between public and private, or private to public specifically, especially when you retire in a place like Ontario. So, I think there's really good opportunities to work more closely together with various stakeholders around data. Private insurance is just one, but other data sets, even registry data and that kind of thing. And Nicole, I'm sure, will speak to more of that. But I think, there's an opportunity where we've started a partnership or a relationship, and we'd like to continue that if we get more questions that are suitable to looking at the whole picture. Thanks.
Mandy, I think this question is for you, and it's regarding the increased use of real-world evidence, or RWE, going forward. Do we have a timeline that can be communicated on when guidance to the industry might be expected? So I know Nicole may touch on it in her presentation, so I don't know if there's anything preemptively. Nicole, would you like to answer?
Yeah, thanks very much. I will talk about it a little bit in the presentation, but we're in the process of putting together some guidance and standards, and then along which timeline, early, late, or at the submission part as well.
Thanks. And perhaps before I go to the last question I've got at this point, I just wanted to touch on the response that Peter gave with use to information from other data sources. And as someone who was previously a decision maker in a jurisdiction about what products are covered or not, the question about looking at our products differently is consistent with CADTH's commitment to make sure that it's not only that we're looking at products at the front end when they are introduced, but it's also to be looking at them through the life cycle to make sure that non-optimal products are exiting as appropriate. And that can happen in pharmaceuticals, that can happen in devices. And it's very difficult to be able to get a complete picture of what's happening with only pockets of the information. And I think, the other important reflection is that, as Peter said, our primary audience for many of our recommendations are public decision, governments, publicly funded drug plans, other parts of the health system making decisions, but increasingly there are questions that cross those boundaries. And in a world where we have incomplete evidence, people are very anxious for us to look at real world evidence and look at what happens in practice. And it is often an opportunity for us to see what is happening in other data sets, such as what's happening in private industry. So again, it's another way for us to be making sure that we're pulling all of the available information into us for our reflections as we try and make decisions. The last question I'm going to turn to you, Brent, for, and I'll chime in as well if need be. But it's obvious that CADTH has an ambitious plan. And what about the additional human and financial resources it will need to be able to do this work and deliver on this new approach to delivering service?
So that's something we're struggling with all the time, quite frankly, in particular because other bodies outside of CADTH seem to desire our workforce. And I think it's cognizant on us to just watch how many reviews are coming forward. I think the more information that we can get around pending submissions, the better. It's very difficult for us to predict volumes because when we do talk to manufacturers, that information is often not shared with us, at least for us to be able to plan the amount of resources that we require. I think fortunately we have staff across the organization that can help us in times when we do have significant volumes of reviews, and so we're very thankful to that. We have also been talking with our funders around possibilities with increases to funding to help with the resourcing. And also we have made some adjustments to our submission fees, again, to help deal with the volume of submissions that are coming forward. So I think we're proud to say that we've never been able to we haven't put ourselves into a queuing type situation over the last few years, considering the volume of submissions that's come forward. But I think that's been, we've had great support from our HR team as we're looking to recruit numerous resources into the team. bringing them up to speed with respect to the work that we do, hoping to retain them as long as possible. And I think it's just an ongoing fact that we have to deal with as we're keeping the teams together.
And if I could just chime in on it, there's been a lot of work done over the past number of years. As Brent has said, the demands placed on our pharmaceutical review teams has grown at a pace that perhaps it was never originally funded for, and a number of efforts were undertaken in the last year to be able to stabilize the program in a way to bring it up to sort of where we expect it to be. But as you've seen by the numbers, the expectation is for continued rapid change. For those of you who may not be familiar, it hasn't been stated earlier in the presentation today, CADTH is primarily funded by the provinces, the federal government, and the provinces and territories, with some funding from industry sponsors for our pharmaceutical reviews or our scientific advice program, and we're needing to continue to make changes. We're also at a moment in time where we are at our opportunity to refresh our funding model, and so that's something that's very top of mind. And one of the things I spoke about this morning was the importance of the CADTH purpose statement and the strategic plan being our North Star and helping us to make tough decisions. And I think that is one of the things that as we work through the next 3 years is there will be choices about things that will need to be left behind, things that will need to be done differently. Those things will include efficiencies that we need to look at, but they will also perhaps be changes in frequency and other things that we haven't yet imagined. So I appreciate the question. There is obviously an insatiable appetite for evidence to inform decisions going forward. And as we start to have to make the decisions about where to focus our energy, we do see that there will be some repurposing, but there will always be difficult decisions to make. And I would also put a plug in, as Brent did, that if anyone who is listening, if you're in the field of pharmaceuticals, research, devices, clinical interventions, it's a great team to work with. Hopefully you'll get to see a snapshot of that this afternoon as you meet different members of the team. And it is a place that is very dynamic and has a lot of opportunity for greater impact influence than it has for the last 30 years in its next 3+ years going forward. And with that, we're going to take a 15-minute break, which I think will bring us back at about 5 after 2, or 5 minutes after the hour, wherever you are in Canada. So with that, we will rejoin you in the not too distant future. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. And thanks. I know this has already been a long day, but I can't tell you how much we appreciate the comments and questions that are coming in. And before I turn it over to the next part of the afternoon, I did want to note that there are suggestions that are coming in on the questions as well. For example, would CADTH consider using track change versions to make it easier for people to re-review? So we'll compile those suggestions and share them with the respective teams. So if you do have other pieces of feedback, please don't hesitate to share them, or as I indicated this morning, to reach out to CADTH through the requests at cadth.ca. So now we're going to get some updates from some other parts of CADTH. So first up, an update on patient engagement from Sarah Bergeles, our Manager of Patient Engagement at CADTH. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Suzanne. Good afternoon. Now, as you heard from my colleagues, all across the organisation, we're involving patients and communities in new ways. Patients and clinicians help decide our top technology trends to watch. We hosted a panel of people living with dementia to understand the diverse needs that exist for dementia care. And we spoke with youth to learn more about peer support and mental health. With our Patient and Community Advisory Committee, we're working to build structural and cultural competency at CADTH, to identify and address evidence gaps, and be proactive and inclusive in our engagement. We continue to appreciate the efforts of new and long-time patient group contributors to CADTH, and we have a new resource that highlights the impact of your involvement on our website, and the link's there. Now, expert and advisory committees are an important part of CADTH's work. And of the 16 roles we're currently looking to fill, 7 are for patients. We're looking for a person with lived experience of the healthcare system to join our Canadian Drug Expert Committee, CADTH. And we're looking for 4 new members to join our Patient and Community Advisory Committee. We're also looking for an ethicist and an economist to join our Health Technology Expert Review Panel, HTERP. And as Leslie talked about the panel, this is a panel that focuses on medical devices and clinical interventions. We're seeking a chair and a procurement professional for our Device Advisory Committee. And you'll hear more from Tarry about our new post-market drug evaluation program. Here we're looking for a chair, 2 data analysts, 2 clinicians, and 2 patients for the advisory committee. This slide has the details for the recruitment, explain how you can contribute to the diversity of perspectives offered, and apply by April 25th. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And if anybody has questions regarding the information that Sarah's presented, please feel free to include it in the chat as directed using the raised hand icon in the top right-hand corner, and we'll circle back around to those during the open forum. Next up, we have 3 updates highlighting different aspects of CADTH's approach to life cycle management of health technologies: real-world evidence, scientific advice, and post-market drug evaluation. We'll kick off this discussion with Dr. Nicole Mittman, CADTH's Chief Scientist and Vice President, Evidence Standards.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics around real-world evidence and real-world data. You've heard a little bit about some of the initiatives throughout the organization. You've heard from Andra, who talked about medical imaging. You've heard from Peter, who talked about some of the utilization work, actually leveraging both private and public data. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the work that CADTH is doing. So I thought we would level set, make sure that we're all talking about the same kind of definition. So what are we calling real-world data, and what are we calling real-world evidence? So real-world data is an umbrella term for data collected outside of a randomized clinical trial. And the evidence is then derived from an analysis of that particular data. We're considering real-world data and real-world evidence as complementary to the randomized clinical trial. It is not a replacement. It is used to fill gaps in certainty and uncertainty, and certainly offers a portrait of care often for patients who are involved or have a condition that when we're reviewing a technology. It includes data from multiple sources, including administrative data sets, registries, observations from clinical practice, and patient-reported outcomes, as we heard from Sarah earlier. So maybe I would emphasize that CADTH already uses and accepts RWE. We use real-world evidence and real-world data for our submissions, for when we're reviewing our health technologies. We use it for understanding the comparator or the landscape. Patient-reported outcome data comes from real-world evidence. Utility data or health preference data also usually comes from evidence that is outside of the clinical trial paradigm. So as we try and use that evidence to inform the way we make decisions or the way we make recommendations, we're filling in the gaps around what we actually have from a randomized clinical trial. So let's talk about a few of the initiatives that we've been working on. So in October of 2021, we held a Best Brains Exchange. And the Best Brains Exchange are the premier knowledge mobilization event at CIHR. And this was a collaboration with CIHR, the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, or CORD, and Health Canada. And in that Best Brains Exchange, we brought together 150 stakeholders over a 2-day period where we talked about issues and barriers around using real-world evidence and even how to access real-world evidence. We had representatives from 13 different types of stakeholders, from data holders all the way to payers. And we had a multi-stakeholder group breakout session where we actually used a sham sort of technology to review and to understand how would we build evidence to help support decision-making in this uncertain world. So part of the work then has led to a foundation of understanding the landscape and creating inventories of registries, registry holders, data holders, as well as individuals who are actually analysts and can use this particular data. We also, in November of 2021, launched our learning period, so our RWE learning period at the CADTH Symposium. And this offers us an opportunity to look at data in a different way and to look at our processes and the work that we do with the lens of RWE. And so working on demonstration projects and or working on or identifying learning opportunities for us to help build our competence in real-world evidence. So what I can tell you is sort of in the first year of our learnings in real-world evidence is that we have 3 real issues in Canada. We have a coordination problem. No one knows where the data is. People are working in silos with respect to analysis. They're often working on answering the same question in multiple different jurisdictions. So how do we ensure that people are aware of the work that is going on? The next one is awareness. So we might not be aware of who's working in the area, who's the expert, who are the methodologists. So building some of the registry inventory or the database inventory or understanding where to find information that actually would fit under a real-world data umbrella is really key. The last one is we have a data problem. We often have more data than we know what to do with, but we might not know where it is, or it might be housed on a desktop. Or it might be housed behind a paywall. And so how do we actually create that awareness and coordinate those activities when using data? So one of the ways we've been talking about real-world evidence is to say that it's really important to have a multi-stakeholder team to understand what is the most important information that we need to help inform decision makers. And so that can help define our outcomes, it can help define our methods, it can help define the patient groups that we need to engage with, and it can help define the data holders who we need to work with in order to help support some of the RWE work. So we have 2 goals here at CADTH at the moment. Provide learnings to Health Canada to support their rare disease strategy, and this fits under our Anticipate umbrella. And 2, to develop methods and standards for CADTH. So as we look at our appraisals and reviews for drugs in the rare disease space as well, and beyond the rare disease space. So we heard a question earlier from Mandy about what is the timing of this. So we're working together to create standards and guidance on what is acceptable and what kind of quality we're looking at. So there are 4 real key areas that we're looking at, and the multi-stakeholder approach is something that we're really looking toward bringing everybody together in a coordinated manner so individuals and organizations know how to interact with one another and then also how to learn from one another with respect to their priorities. We're also looking at different ways to generate and access real-world data. So some of that comes through either expert support or actually accessing data and conducting learning projects. And we have a saying in the real-world evidence team is learn by doing. We're looking at collaborative partnerships, and I can highlight that we're working specifically with data holders. For example, we've partnered with the Canadian Institutes for Health Information to help understand what are the kinds of data we need to help support the gaps that we have or to support or decrease the uncertainty in some of the evidence that comes to us in either submissions or in our reviews. And then we're also looking to create some guidance. And I mentioned that in an earlier slide around what does that look like for not only from the health technology assessment space, but also from the regulatory space. So as we think about the life cycle approach, data also has a life cycle, but even how do we think about data and where does it touch each of the time points in the CADTH structure. So is there an opportunity for early dialogue to understand what kinds of outcomes are required, bring that multi-stakeholder approach to enable that kind of dialogue? Can we actually think about it after the pivotal trial? What kind of data do we need? Did we get the right kind of data? Is it an intermediate outcome? And what if we're looking for more health system data or final clinical data outcomes? How do we generate that particular data? Post-dialogue, what is required? And we heard a little bit about time-limited recommendations. Is this the opportunity to start to engage and think, well, here's the time-limited, and build evidence and start an evidence-building program that's fit for purpose for that particular disease or condition? And post-market dialogue, so having some discussion around what's part of a reassessment, and can this data be used as part of a reassessment, and how do we evaluate that particular data as well? So I wanted to highlight that we have an RWE steering committee, and this is co-chaired by Health Canada and CADTH. And there are a number of individuals and organizations who are part of this steering committee. And in doing so, we hope to understand and learn how to collaborate more, how to ensure and decide on priority projects, and also ensure that we're actually using the best quality data. You can see from the slide that we have membership from industry, we have membership who are data holders. We have invited experts who are methodological experts as well, including our funding organizations and our Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance, along with payers as well. The RWE Steering Committee has initiated 4 or 5 projects. Those 5 projects have been organized into working groups, and the working groups consider oncology products and non-oncology products. And here we're looking at notice of compliance with conditions and looking at projects that have that kind of criteria upon approval from Health Canada, and how do we follow up and ensure that we actually have data to support the conditions that were part of the NOC. We also have, as mentioned, a guidance group, so creating and not reinventing the wheel. Lots of guidance has been created, lots of standards have been created. How do we put it all together to make it fit for purpose for CADTH? We have another group that is looking at safety and accessing data for effectiveness work as well. And so how do we access and how do we create that inventory of data that's available for us? And then also there's looking at rare diseases and working specifically on rare diseases that may have uncertainty associated with either the technology and or the disease, which will allow us then to look further into what kind of evidence could we generate, could we learn from, could we leverage from existing data sets. So just looking at some of the innovative work that we're doing through the RWE team, developing an inventory of databases and rare disease registries, developing partnerships with data holders. I've already mentioned CADTH, but Statistics Canada and the Health Data Research Network. So those would be the individuals or organizations or groups that would allow us to potentially access their data, learning what's the feasibility, what's the utility of that particular data, how long does it take to ask for data, what are the governance structures around that particular data, and moreover, how much does that data cost? So learning some of the practical issues around not just what's the content of the database, but also the quality and governance of that particular data set. And there are a number of other partnerships, not only within Canada, but also internationally. So this is just, I mentioned, a learn by doing. Here are a number of projects that are really disease projects that have either come to us or you've heard from the provinces and territories where they're particularly interested in understanding what are the needs or the gaps or the portrait of care in a particular disease. We're working together with Peter and his team on a number of those initiatives, understanding the utilization, understanding what are the important outcomes, understanding the data sets that are available to us. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy Sood, who will talk about scientific advice, and Amy is our manager of scientific advice. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Nicole. My name's Amy Sood, and I'll be providing an update on the scientific advice program at CADTH, which really focuses on the early aspect of the life cycle of a drug. And later you'll hear from Terry, who will talk about the post-market space. As many of you already know, CADTH Scientific Advice is an opportunity for pharmaceutical companies to engage early with CADTH. It's an opportunity to get feedback on trial design very early in the life cycle of a drug at a time when adjustments to clinical trial design can be made. The goal is to inform evidence generation so that it meets the needs of a future CADTH reimbursement review, and ultimately to support timely access to new drugs. We continue to offer advice from CADTH alone or in collaboration with either Health Canada or NICE. And I wanted to highlight here that questions regarding RWE generation plans are being accepted within the existing process. And that occurs very early, prior to the initiation of pivotal trials. And in fact, 16 of 35 procedures to date have included questions related to RWE plans. I will now turn your attention to what we are planning for the next year and beyond. As you've heard earlier from Nicole about the RWE initiatives at CADTH, I'm really excited to announce that CADTH will be considering the expansion of scientific advice under a one-year learning period. As you can see in this diagram, we will be considering scientific advice after pivotal trials have launched. This initiative will contribute to the Innovate pillar of the strategic plan and demonstrate agility in our response to incorporating more RWE into our scientific advice program. Under this learning period, we will consider requests after pivotal trials have initiated. And as you know, this is different from what we have offered in the past, and it expands on the eligibility criteria. Priority will go to requests for rare disease and other conditions where there are increased uncertainties, but we may also consider other requests pending availabilities. Any request must include questions related to plans for RWE generation. And we will continue to use CADTH's established scientific advice process for these requests, which includes engagement of clinical experts and patients, as well as a scientific advice meeting and a written advice report. Economic modeling questions will also be accepted as part of these applications, as well as questions related to the clinical trial program. At the end of this learning period, CADTH will determine whether it will formally offer this service, including any criteria for eligibility. I wanted to take a moment here to emphasize that early scientific advice prior to pivotal trial initiation still plays an important role, and it will continue to be an opportunity to identify evidence gaps that could be addressed by modifications to the clinical trial protocols, rather than solely relying on RWE to fill some of these gaps. We can still provide feedback on RWE planning as part of early scientific advice, and that's prior to initiation of pivotal trials. However, we realize that RWE planning is not always feasible at this early stage, and so we hope this new opportunity enhances engagement with CADTH related to RWE generation plans. We hope not only to provide feedback from CADTH's perspective, but also to learn from the requests received, as well as gain early insights into new methods or approaches that could inform current and future CADTH processes or initiatives. So with that, please be in touch if you would like to discuss any potential applications. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amy. That's a great new initiative and very excited, and we'll learn along with you. And my next, I'd like to now introduce Dr. Terry Hahuja, who is the director of the Post-Market Drug Evaluation Program, to talk to us a little bit about a new project we're working on.
Thank you, Nicole. Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for the chance to speak. I'm like a proud papa that's revealing the new baby. I don't know if you really reveal a new baby, but I'm kind of revealing a new baby today. And we mentioned today, Suzanne and both Nicole mentioned our product life cycle and the different points at which we look at information and evidence here at CADTH. So Amy was mentioning our early scientific advice. We're going a little bit further down the line and looking at what I like to call the rearview mirror of our data evidence plan. So like at CADTH, we love our acronyms. I think you're seeing that today. Here's the latest and greatest that we're adding to our dictionary, which is Post-Market Drug Evaluation Program, or PMD program. Okay, so we'll take a couple minutes to explain what exactly post-market drug evaluation actually is. So, as I mentioned, it's really the easy analogy is the rearview mirror. It's us taking a look at the evidence after a medicine or a technology has entered the market and is now available to patients and consumers. And so, through that process, you start to generate real-world evidence. So a lot of the times that evidence is housed in registries or it's held with researchers or large organizations like CADTH, which capture this data, or Stats Can. And a lot of times you don't have the opportunity to go and take a look at that data, to take a look. Once this medicine has entered the market, how has it actually worked? And has it done what it's supposed to? Are there ways for us to adapt and adjust based on this new information? Because we're usually only privy to the information pre-launch. It also then will allow decision makers to take a look at this evidence and see, were the initial decisions they made appropriate? Do things need to be adjusted? Is there ways to increase or improve market access to this medicine if appropriate? So here's the continuum that we're talking about. You can see we're focusing in on the post-market, which is on the end. So sort of the analogy is maybe a dinner with scientific advice being the appetizer, reimbursement reviews being the main course, and real-world evidence being maybe an early dessert, and post-market is the big dessert, of course, minus the calories. So we're going to take a little history lesson and talk about how we ended up in this place with PMD being a new program at CADTH. So the Drug Safety Effectiveness Network was established in 2009 by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or CIHR. And the intent was to create a network that would produce evidence for our federal, provincial, and territorial decision makers to help give them the evidence they need where there's gaps, and leveraging some of the real-world data that exists. So you can see real-world data has been around for a while. It's not necessarily a new thing, but it's become much more prominent over the last few years. We also wanted to increase the capacity of Canada to undertake generation of this post-market data, drug evaluation data, so we can make these types of decisions. So the program was evaluated. It was reevaluated several times throughout the process, but the most recent in 2019, they highlighted some of the positives of the program, is that it was producing post-market drug information in an environment that was constantly changing. So while we lean on the pillars that CADTH produces in terms of data review and evidence review, the rapidly evolving environment requires the ability and the need to innovate and be adaptive. And the idea of this network was that it was doing that in a lot of ways. It also highlighted the need for expedited drug evaluation. So as we heard today, the needs for aligned reviews or NOCCs where there is a request for information. We provide access to the medicine, but we want follow-up information, follow-up evidence so we can reevaluate based on this real-world evidence. So these are all some of the things that were highlighted as valuable assets and valuable endeavors to continue. And also highlighted, DSEN did a great job in building capacity and highlighting training opportunities. And so we were fortunate to be granted the opportunity to transition this DSEN network to CADTH. And so CADTH has been working quite ambitiously over the last few months to establish a transition team to bring this DSEN network to CADTH and re-envision it and innovate it and adapt it to meet the needs of 2022 and onwards. So the CADTH transition team, in which I am the director, and we've built a great team to do this work, has been working alongside Health Canada and CHR to make sure that transition happens and happens well. And we wanted to maintain a lot of the positive aspects of the current DSEN model while incorporating some brand new components that, again, reflect the innovation that's required to meet the changing needs of our environment. So our goal, our I want to say finish line or launch line is September 2022, which is coming up very, very quickly. We started this endeavor, I would say, in September of last year. So it'll be less than a year that we actually been working to do this. So we'll take a quick sneak peek into what the program looks like. There's a decent amount of information available on our landing page on the CADTH site, so you can always refer to that for more details. But in our session today, I wanted to highlight what are some of the goals of this program and what it looks like and where we're headed. So first off, we wanted to create a network that was able to efficiently respond to the needs of these decision makers. And we wanted to build this network with applied researchers, methodologists, and data analysts to meet those needs. We wanted to create a network that would produce PMDE or post-market drug information and do that as a collaborative community and share information, awareness, and linkages within that network that we're creating. So that's really, really important and leverage the strengths of the network versus individuals or individual teams even. Next, we wanted to improve on the uptake and utilization of the evidence that is produced by this network. And that's one of the strengths that we've heard all throughout the day today of our knowledge mobilization and implementation assets and skills here at CADTH. And we really want to lean on that to ensure that the great work that the network does should really be disseminated throughout for those who need it. A lot of decision makers have similar questions, and sometimes these questions are done in redundancy or duplication. We wanted to continue to grow, innovate, and improve. So we wanted to create a culture of continuous quality improvement. That's really, really key. And then finally, we wanted to foster national and international PMD partnerships with those around the world that are doing similar work. And we've already started that process in engaging with the FDA Sentinel program and the ENSA program in France. These groups are already doing what we're striving to do, suited clearly for their regional environment, but the objectives are very similar to what we were trying to do. So, aligning with our pillars that we've been inundating you with today, I think repetition is key here. We want to show how we're aligning because it's really important in how we execute and deliver ourselves. So the first is to anticipate, and we want to work with our decision makers. And again, CADTH is really fortunate to have great communication and relationships with our decision makers in our country. So we want to work with them to help us understand what are your evidentiary needs, what do you need answered, and how can we help? The second is we want to innovate and make sure that we're using the latest and greatest techniques and methods and the latest and greatest in how questions are being answered from around the world and leverage real-world evidence. And finally, we want to transform. We want to allow decision makers to modernize the healthcare system and really do that with great PMDE. We talked a little bit about formulary management and harmonization within our country, and I think these types of pockets of evidence will allow us to do that and do it well. Okay, so I'm going to show an overly complicated figure, and I know it's going to be kind of hard to see, but like we said, our slides are available. But I wanted to show you just really high level how we see the architecture and the blueprint of our program. So up top, you will see a bunch of blue circles with a variety of individuals, and these are our decision makers that we're attempting to service. So we have Health Canada, we have our federal drug programs, we have a variety of folks that can put forth questions and queries. Those will then enter our network and our program, and we'll go to start off into our centralized group that we're calling the PMD Operations Center. This group will work, this team will work to help really flesh out the question. And a lot of times, decision makers themselves have said, we have a question, but we don't know exactly what we're asking. And we really want to work on honing in on the question, identifying what the policy question is, and getting to a point where we can meet their needs. Come to some agreement in feasibility. What is the appropriate product? Is this question already been answered? Those types of questions. On the side, you'll see a dotted line to our advisory committee, and this is a great group that we're putting together. And as Sarah's mentioned, there's a call for nominations now, so go check that out if you're interested. And it's a group that's going to bring some strategy, so strategic thinking, and bring some innovation and awareness of the latest and greatest approaches and how questions can be answered. Maybe revisit some of our complex queries to see if we got it right and what were different ways of doing this, and creating a form of collaboration. Now, once that is teed up and we see that this query is going to move forward, we've created 3 pockets of resources that we're going to use to build our network. The first being our core network partners. These are individuals that are teams of multifaceted individuals that will bring our foundational teams to our network, and they'll be receiving grant funding for several years to be that go-to structure within our network. This will only be complemented by standing offer contractors and ad hoc contractors that we will lean on as required when the query being asked goes outside of the normal skill set of our core network partners. So you can imagine questions coming in can be anything under the sun. And COVID has been a great example of how we weren't really asking a lot of infectious disease questions about 2.5 years ago, and now those are a lot of our primary questions. And so this will allow us to expand our skill set and scale up or scale down as required. I wanted to just quickly show this slide. A lot of questions have been asked about, well, how do we fit within how CADTH currently does business? And how are we going to fit into the system? And how are you engaging with those outside of your bubble? And while this is not an exhaustive list, this is our broad buckets that we're looking at. And you can see that we're going to be engaging with the RW team. We already are in terms of identifying the appropriate framework around how real-world evidence should be incorporated, how should it be used, and finding really valuable resources within our data-rich country. Working with Brent's team and Mandy's team for pharmaceutical reviews to see if there are data needs that are being sort of highlighted in the reviews before this drug comes to market. Are these things that we can start to proactively set up to capture this data so that once it becomes to market, we're positioned to find that data. Finally, our ISKM team internally to really disseminate this great information that this network is going to produce. And I think a cornerstone of CADTH is our engagement outside of our walls, and that's with industry, with patients, and with clinicians, and that's really important to this program as well. And we've tried to incorporate them throughout the process from beginning to end and are looking for more opportunities to engage us. We're really open to that dialogue if you have suggestions. We're going to finish off with a couple of points. So one here is our advisory committee. I've mentioned that. So we're looking for a multidisciplinary group that brings a variety of different assets to the table, to bring different perspectives to the table, and to allow us to have these really strategic conversations. So we're looking for FPT decision makers. We're looking for more applied researchers, methodologists, data analysts, clinicians, patients, industry. So really a great forum for conversation, and that opportunity is open to a lot of folks. So go ahead and check that out. We're going to finish up with where we are. So looking forward, we know I've already mentioned that September 1st is our launch date, and so where are we in the process? So we currently have our 2 RFPs that are up for individuals to put their hand up and saying, I want to be part of this network. And we've been really overwhelmed and pleased with the feedback that we're getting thus far. I already mentioned the advisory committee. We're going to be then expanding our team, and we're going to be giving out the results of those applicants who put their hands up to say we want to be part of this network. And we want to position ourselves to start to build up that process and get ourselves ready and be systems ready to start taking in queries. And then in July and August, we're going to really onboard the network, the team, and position ourselves to open for business September 1st. Here are some resources that you can go check out. I won't go through this whole list, but we do have a landing page on the CADTH site, which has tons of great information. And we've also hosted our own info sessions, so you can check those out if there are more specific program questions there. And we'll be putting a lot more information in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole, Amy, and Terry. Again, a reminder, we're going to pause now and take a few questions. So I have a couple teed up, but if you have additional questions, please feel free to use the icon in the top right-hand corner. I guess I would just make a couple of quick observations. There was a question this morning about how is all of our work in the RWE space and the life cycle management going to look to connect the dots between organizations such as the PCPA, government decision makers, etc. So I hope that people found it helpful to see the depiction of the RWE steering committee, that all of the groups that people included in their questions this morning are at that table, and they're intricately involved in both discussing the needs and developing the guidelines and what it is that we need to go forward. The other thing that's quite unique is you probably could tell by the conversation, we are already accepting RWE even in advance of that. So it's not that we're waiting for a perfect moment in time. And as Nicole said, we're learning by doing. I know that that's not always the easiest, and it does come with growing pains, but it does allow us to continue the forward momentum and learn as we go. Now, there were a couple of questions that I wanted to flag. So the first one, Nicole, is to you. And it was with interest to the work that you had reflected on with an inventory of patient registries? And will CADTH consider sharing their database inventory with industry partners?
That's a great question. Thanks very much. And our inventory will actually be published, and we'll have that information available, so it will be shareable.
Nicole did not say it in her answer, but I can tell you she's very committed to open data. And so consistent with CADTH's desire for greater transparency, we do think a lot of the solutions that we can find going forward do come with us being more willing to share the information we have and allow others to be able to benefit from each other's work. I'm going to take a stab at the next question. It's been communicated by the CDA, the Canadian Drug Agency Transition Office, that they will be taking a closer look at data in Canada, leveraging this data for decision-making and creating alignment across jurisdictions. How is CADTH working with the CDA-TO to ensure there will be communication and alignment of efforts? So maybe I'll start and I'll ask Nicole to chime in if I've missed anything. The first thing I would say is that we are regularly involved in discussions with both the Canadian Drug Agency Transition Office and CIHI on work that is going on in this space. We sit at the same tables, we share our work, and we have the opportunity to connect our teams. There is more than enough work to go around in the data space. And what I guess if I could capture in the immediate term, we're looking at being able to immediately use information that's available to us while we participate in and lead aspects of planning for what do we need for the future. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Nicole, if there's anything else you'd like to share.
Well, thank you very much, and I think that's a very comprehensive answer. I might just add that we're also looking to not only understand what the data sets are and the data needs for the stakeholders, and so what kinds of information, so maybe drug information, how do we find that from either public or private sources, and or what are the outcomes that we're linking into that life cycle approach. So not only being able to have an index date of when a treatment starts, but being able to follow it through the life cycle. So there's more than enough work with respect to understanding the methods, understanding the inventories or the places where this data is sometimes shared or not shared, but also then the expertise to be able to pull out that data and access it along the way. So very a close relationship.
Thanks, Nicole. Terry, the next question is for you. How will the work be prioritized for PMDE?
Thanks for that question. It's a great question. And we're really fortunate in that we've positioned ourselves to be able to take a lot of queries in initially, and we're thinking that we will not have to prioritize much up front. Now, being forward-thinking, we know our program is going to be a smash, and so we're going to get a lot of queries, and we will be put in a position to have to prioritize. And we internally at CADTH have several factors that we consider for prioritization, and we'll lean on that. And we're also going to incorporate some of the feedback that we're getting through this process of development. So there will be a prioritization process that we will have instilled. And currently we're looking at reactive versus proactive projects, and we're also looking at the need in terms of timing. So those will be some of the initial factors that we consider in terms of which projects we initiate and which ones we hold off on.
Thank you. Thanks, Terry. A suggestion, a comment that came through, it would be helpful to have a subpage on CADTH's website with what's going on in the continuum of life cycle, RWE, especially the report out of the best brain session so that people can see how their input is being utilized. So again, maybe from a corporate perspective, one of the things on CADTH's work plan this year is also looking to make a much more interactive and user-friendly website. And so the feedback that we have received previously about some of the challenges and the types of things that we would like to see in the future are greatly appreciated. So I'll be sure to pass those comments along as well. I don't think I've seen any other questions at this point. So again, we have one speaker left, and after that we will be going to our open forum. So again, if you do have any outstanding questions from any part of today, please feel free to use the icon in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So right now we will turn over to our final speaker of the afternoon, Julia Thompson, who is a corporate risk advisor at CADTH, and she'll provide an update on conflict of interest. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. So good afternoon. I'm pleased to close out the presentations today with an update on the work being done to modernize our conflict of interest policy and process in the coming year. Before we jump in, when talking about conflict of interest, we mean a situation that may create a bias that could influence objectivity or fairness in decision-making or outcomes. The perception of conflict of interest is harmful because it undermines trust, raises doubts about fairness, and damages the damages the credibility of decision-making processes. As you've heard today, transparency is an important element in CADTH's new strategic plan. To protect the integrity of our work, we need to eliminate as much bias as possible. This means anticipating, identifying, and managing conflicts, but also being transparent about the interests in our work so that the audience can make their own decisions about the advice, given the full disclosure of the facts. It's important to remember that having a conflict of interest isn't unethical and that, in general, everyone has interests that are likely to conflict at some point or another. A common misconception is that declaring a conflict of interest means that the input will automatically be discounted, but this is not the case. The idea isn't to exclude input, but to be transparent about where conflict exists so that the effects of interests are known and can be understood and managed. In managing a conflict, some considerations might include the role of the individual in decision-making, the nature of the conflicting interest, and how close the conflicting interest is to the individual. There are many ways that a conflict can be managed to both allow the individual to give the right level of input to enable the best possible decision and protect the integrity of decision-making. Looking ahead, our existing conflict of interest policies will be harmonized into a singular version to standardize our policy, update terminology and improve language to provide additional clarity, and provide additional transparency about how CADTH assesses and manages conflicts. The standard for what constitutes a conflict of interest isn't changing under the updated policy, but we will be expanding conflict reporting beyond financial interests to also include non-financial interests like benefits to reputation and other relevant interests like intellectual interests, for example, holding strong publicly stated beliefs about a topic. This update aligns with the evolution of conflict of interest concepts and supports transparency to identify, understand, and manage the interests in our work. Additionally, we'll be moving away from a manual process and introducing a new centralized software system for submitting, updating, and managing disclosures. The new automated system will make the declaration submission and updating of declarations a lot easier. Simply log into the system, add or update your information, and hit the Save button. No need to fill out your information again or dig out an old printer to print, scan, sign, all of those things to get your form submitted. The assigned CADTH staff will receive your declaration and follow up if there are any questions. And we'll be able to set up auto reminders if you are due to update your declaration. In terms of timelines, we are targeting fall 2022 to launch these changes. And we will be developing guidance materials to support the transition to an updated policy and preparing how-to documents for using the new software system to submit and update declarations. So with that, stay tuned for more to come, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you to everyone. I hope you found the updates this afternoon informative and relevant to your work and organizations. It's always hard to be able to figure out what to share with you at a moment in time with so much going on in the organization, particularly at this moment where we're launching a new strategic plan. So at this point, we're opening the lines again to take questions on any part of the conversation today. If there is an individual in particular that you would like to have answer your question, please feel free to indicate that in your question, and we'll be happy to direct it to the individuals. I would just want to highlight that with me today, you have seen three of our executive leads, Dr. Nicole Mittman, Brent Fraser, Dr. Leslie Dunville, and also with us today, but not sitting at the front table with us, is Heather Logan, who's available virtually, as well as Megan Ashley Bowes, who is with us here in person today. So if there are any questions that we haven't touched on today, please don't hesitate to ask them. We'll do our best to be able to answer on the fly. We do have time for questions, but we also appreciate that people are getting tired. So we'll see what the next few moments hold and make a determination of whether you've had enough of us. And I do appreciate my colleagues who have added humor to the day because it's not one of my fortes. So with regard to bias and conflict of interest, there's a question about CADTH's stance on organizations receiving funds from pharma directly for their patient submissions. CCS does not do this, but there are some organizations out there that do. Are there plans to reduce this conflict of interest? I think you've answered that question in your presentation. I don't think it's a stance we take. It is about being transparent with what conflicts of interest exist, whether those are financial, non-financial, whether those are your personal perspective, your research bias, whatever those things might be. As Julia said, it doesn't mean that there is no value. It doesn't mean that the value of your input is discounted, but it needs to be transparent that there are existing potential conflicts. With that, Julia, is there anything I didn't cover, or Sarah, anything that you would like to add from a patient perspective that may be helpful to that response?
Thank you. So with regard to patient groups and looking at the conflict of interest, patient groups have always been very, very good in completing the declaration. A really important thing that we always look at, and the committee members always look at, is understanding the group's mandate. So a group whose mandate is to bring new drugs to the market may provide more emphasis or information about one aspect versus a group perhaps whose mandate is focused on patient safety and concerns around harms. So that mandate is really important, and the conflict of interest statement is part of the process that everyone who participates in our program, whether that's committee members, whether that's clinicians, whether that's CADTH staff, we all complete so that there is transparency.
Thank you, Sarah. Nicole, the next question is for you, and it's a question about RWE. And the question relates to the fact that drugs are introduced at different rates in different countries around the world. And so sometimes when products are being considered in other jurisdictions, such as Canada, they may already be in place and being funded elsewhere. Is there consideration about how we would work internationally in the RWE space?
Yeah, thanks very much, Suzanne. That's a great question, and one of the things that we have, not only with the slogan of "just do it" or "let's learn by doing," we've also wanted not to duplicate. And so part of the work that we've also been doing is not only liaising with our Canadian colleagues, but also our international colleagues to learn specifically about some of the work that they're doing in the RWE space, understanding methods, understanding techniques, understanding registries. And so sometimes in a rare disease space, we might not have enough individuals in the Canadian context, but there may be an opportunity to leverage then the international space, or perhaps other kinds of data sets that are actually initiated outside of the Canadian border. So that helps us then understand, what kind of methods are they using? What's the governance of that kind of work? How did patients consent to be part of that work? So all of that work is going on in the background to understand the quality, the standards, and the kinds of content for international work along with Canadian work, so that we can perhaps leverage it as well.
Thanks, Nicole. And I would just reinforce that as Nicole was speaking, we've had the opportunity to be at conferences recently, including both industry and HTA organizations. And there is a real desire to, as I said earlier in the day, there may be pieces of information that can't be shared. But for example, in jurisdictions where managed entry agreements exist, can we learn about what is being collected to be able to inform and build consistency and help us get to some of those masses, sufficient number of pieces of information to inform a decision making into the future. So the question that's being asked is being called on at both the industry and HTA organizations internationally. A question for you, Leslie. What triggers a condition level review, and what are some of the potential implications of the review?
So with our condition level reviews, and as Gino mentioned, we're only on our second condition level review now. And so we're targeting conditions that have the potential to have multiple questions on different components of the condition, so from prevention to treatment to management of the condition, as well as spanning both drug and device technologies. And so really looking at spanning the entire breadth of the condition. And we're also, as Gino mentioned, every one of them looks quite different. And so with the recent one on post-COVID condition, that was a natural next one to take on, considering the state right now. But we've had other ones that are on very specific conditions. We've had ones suggested on very broad conditions. And so it's ensuring that we're able to make an impact on something that is specific, that there are outstanding questions, that there are outstanding gaps, or where we can bring all of the evidence together. And some of the potential values is that convening role and bringing the evidence together in one place where it is useful and it's easy to find for decision makers. And so bringing everything from prevention to treatment to management onto one platform. And it doesn't necessarily mean this is all information that CADTH has developed, but it's convening and collaborating with others as well. And so it really is that opportunity to engage and trying to make the evidence more accessible.
Thanks, Leslie. And if I could just say on behalf of the team that does work on the condition level reviews, they're a tremendous amount of work. Unlike some of our other projects that are very slices of information, this is very comprehensive, and you're looking at gathering the information and appraising the evidence across a full range of a spectrum of an illness. So being careful to identify those ones that have greatest impact is really important as we look to make sure that the time is well spent and helps inform decisions going forward. Another question from the RWE perspective. So Nicole, if I could ask you to jump in on this one. Will patient support program data ever be considered as part of RWE from a CADTH perspective?
Another great question. We've actually started engaging with industry, who are often the primary sort of supporters of patient support programs, often to provide access to patients, and asking about the quality of the data, the content of the data. So we're actually looking at it from a standards point of view, from a metrics point of view, how accessible it is. Often some of the questions that we have are around the representativeness of the data that's actually included in the patient support programs. So we're just embarking on those kinds of questions with industry, and have been collaborating with IMC Biotech around a post our Best Brains Exchange to understand more about patient support programs.
Thanks, Nicole. Brent, could you share a bit more context behind the reason for non-sponsored review consultation? What is the key issue that this new work is aimed to address?
I think it stems from questions that we often get from drug plans about requests that they're receiving either from a group of clinicians or from patients about the funding of a particular drug for a particular indication. And when we go back to the, what we typically do is we will check with all of the other drug plans to see if this is a question that they encounter themselves, so that it's not just one jurisdiction, it's pan-Canadian. And if that's the case and they would like us to look at this more closely, we will then reach out to the sponsor to see if they plan on submitting for that particular indication. And quite often the answer is no. And so we're sort of left in a case where the sponsor will not submit the information. There's a jurisdictional need and a patient need for criteria or guidance around funding for a particular request. And that's where we would look at doing a non-sponsored review. We have in the past, in very limited circumstances, have done clinician-led reviews where clinician groups will put together the clinical information and sort of identify the need and place in therapy for us. And then we can often reach out to the manufacturer to see if they could help us with the economic evaluation. Again, some companies are not interested at all in doing that. Others are very supportive of doing it. And so it's just that kind of gap. We often see it with older drugs that have been on the market for an extended period of time, but all of a sudden there's a new treatment or study that's come out that show that it might be effective in a particular area. The other case that we often encounter is where our initial recommendation is now out of date because other treatments have come in. There's been new evidence that has come forward. We've seen this in the cardiac space where the criteria that were initially recommended by CADTH really don't situate themselves in today's clinical environment. But because there's been such a lengthy period of time between the initial review and today, the companies themselves may have evolved from focusing on that particular medication and are really focused on other treatment options. And so there may be a need for us to do a non-sponsored type review in those cases.
Thank you, Brent. And with that, it looks like there's a pause in questions coming at this point in time. So with that, I'm going to call our 2022 CADTH information session to a close. I would like to thank all of our guests for their time and participation. I'd like to thank the CADTH staff for the time they spent communicating our work and impact. And a special thank you to all of the CADTH staff and our event staff and the company who have assisted making today a successful event. I also want to thank everyone who spent all or part of the day with us. I certainly look forward to more opportunities to meet, discuss, and engage with you about our work in this space, our new strategic plan, and how to get involved. I'm hoping all of you have seen multiple opportunities for you to become more engaged with CADTH, to become involved in our committees, to participate in our consultations, or find new ways to work with CADTH as we move forward with our new strategic plan. As we close out today, a link to the evaluation survey will appear when you exit. There is also a check mark on the platform in front of you that you can tick that will allow you to go to the evaluation as well. Please do take time to let us know if today's session was useful and how we can make it better next time. And again, please don't forget that we are here to answer questions. So if there are unanswered questions, please feel free to reach out to CADTH at CADTH requests. Thanks again, everyone. Merci, and have a wonderful evening.